The ACC, Big Ten, and Pac-12 discuss a scheduling alliance. The Big 12 seems doomed to failure. And what will the college football playoff format look like after this fall? We'll discuss it all next. I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review.
And now, after further review, a Clemson student's perspective on sports.
And a personal foul on number 99 of the defense after he tackled the quarterback. He's giving them business down there. That's a 15-yard penalty.
Well, hey everyone, thanks for tuning in, and I'm Jay Smith, and this is After Further Review. We got a great episode for you today. A lot to talk about, man. There's been so much going on these past few days as it relates to just conference realignment and schedules and what stuff's going to look like moving forward past, it's kind of crazy. We are, a couple weeks out here from the actual college football season, and we're not even really talking about the actual upcoming season. We're talking about stuff that's, going to take place, maybe a year, 2 years down the line. But that's just because there's so much unknown right now as far as the future landscape of college football. And it's just crazy because, if you'd told anybody all of this a few months ago, most people probably wouldn't have believed you. I don't think I would have believed you if, I had a feeling that Texas, maybe not as much Oklahoma, but really Texas was looking for a move to possibly the Big Ten or the SEC, but I did not expect something of this magnitude, and obviously all the aftershocks of that announcement are still kind of reverberating around the college football landscape. So there's so much news to get into. Let's start off first with our opening topic here, and that is that this news broke yesterday. It was first reported by The Athletic, Max Olson over at The Athletic, and it was that the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Pac-12 are discussing a schedule alliance. It's a loose term. I'm using the air quotes here when I say the word alliance, but supposedly that has been a discussion that's been had between the conference commissioners. I mean, you've got George Kalivkov for the Pac-12. You obviously have Kevin Warren for the Big Ten, and then who's the ACC commissioner? Jim Phillips. That's right. The name was escaping me. Jim Phillips is the commissioner of the ACC. But they've been in regular communication these past few weeks, and they've had some in-person discussions. There's some reports that they had met actually last week in Chicago, an in-person meeting, and they were discussing forming some sort of scheduling alliance. Now, this would not technically be any sort of my conference absorbs your conference or we start switching out teams, but basically it would be a way for these three Power 5 conferences to sort of insulate themselves, and I think it would form a 57-team super league almost, and that would be their answer, the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12's answer to the addition of Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC. So it's sort of interesting. Let's kind of dive, though, into some of the specifics of that, because, again, there's some reports out there of the commissioners from these different conferences meeting. There's actually a few photos floating around on Twitter of that meeting, or of, the commissioners, meeting in person. But, I think any sort of conference scheduling alliance is probably in the very early stages. There's a lot of moving pieces there. There's a lot of rivalry games that would need to be protected. There's a lot of cross-division scheduling and things of that nature. So you're not going to see Clemson taking on Oregon or Utah playing Minnesota. It might be that there's maybe the doors open where ACC, all the conferences play a typical conference schedule, right? Is it 8-9 games, and then your non-conference opponents, and this could be a thing, the non-conference opponents for these three conferences could be exclusive to that alliance, right? Where you've got, ACC schools playing Big Ten schools, and maybe some Big Ten schools are playing Pac-12 schools. Maybe there's a little mixing and matching. I don't think you're going to see a ton of East Coast, West Coast games, just because logistically that is, that's a challenge. And again, it's important to emphasize here, we're not just talking about football programs, right? In terms of a scheduling alliance here, we're talking about, the basketball team, the track and field guys, the women's volleyball team. Like, all of those sports are impacted by these decisions. And again, that's not getting any publicity. It's not getting any coverage. And that's not the subject of this podcast, right? It's a college football podcast. But it's something that you have to think about. All the student athletes are affected by these types of decisions. So, again, what's interesting about this particular development is that there's no mention of the Big 12, right? And the Big 12 is now down to 8 teams. They're still reeling. Their commissioner, Bob Bowlesby, has come out and said that, he kind of feels like this was the result of the ESPN and the SEC commissioner, Greg Sankey, kind of pushing for Texas and Oklahoma to join. Again, that's all speculation. I don't have any information to indicate otherwise. But Pac-12 Commissioner George Kalivkov has met with Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowlesby, and they've had some discussions. But according to sources, that meeting did not include any sort of mentioning of an alliance with other Power 5 conferences. And so that's got to make some athletic directors in the Big 12 worried. I mean, again, and we're going to touch on this in the second segment of the show. What's the possible landing spot for each of the remaining Big 12 schools? Because listen, whether or not you agree or like it, the reality is there's a higher chance of the Big 12 dissolving than it sticking around. And I said that on the most recent episode. I said, listen, I just don't, there are certainly ways. Nothing's concrete, nothing's set in stone. But if I was a betting man, I don't think the Big 12 is going to be around for much longer. There's just, right now, there's no national brand in that conference. I mean, Baylor has had spurts, but they're really not. And now, again, basketball, it's a different conversation, right? You got Kansas, you got Baylor, but the Big Ten could easily, or even the ACC, could pick up either of those schools. And I think you also have to remember, too, while we are discussing football, this is an entire athletic department-wide inclusion into a new conference. So you're not going to see a Notre Dame and ACC situation where Notre Dame kind of cherry picks what sports they want to participate in. And obviously, they participate in all ACC sports except for football. But the example still, stands where these schools are going to join. They're going to be fully committed to their new conferences. It wouldn't make sense for them to do it otherwise. Why would you join the Big Ten and then stay independent in football? Like, that wouldn't make any sense for any school coming out of the Big 12. A lot of people, and this is just what I've seen on Twitter and read in different reports, but a lot of people put the, I guess, I don't want to say blame, but they credit, sounds almost too positive of a word. Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, is the person I think a lot of people are considering the mastermind behind all of this. He was obviously involved in the SEC's addition of Texas and Oklahoma, and he also kind of proposed this 12-team college football playoff model, right? This is been something that he's pushed for a little while, and this is really seen, I think, by a lot of people, myself included to a certain extent, but as a way to consolidate power. And so there is definitely, I'm sure, in the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Pac-12 offices, some discussions about, okay, listen, are we able to fork out on our own, and can we, compete as we've been competing and stand up to the SEC, not just in football, but in any other sport? And right now, I don't think the answer is yes. I mean, we talked a lot last year about which conference was deepest, who could compete for that position, that title. SEC obviously had it, and I thought the Big Ten was going to have a chance, at least in football. It did not pan out. The ACC is still the Clemson Conference. The Pac-12 was fading into oblivion, and the Big 12 had Oklahoma. Now, if I had told you in 2009 that TCU was going to have a more successful 2010 decade run in football. If TCU was going to be more successful in football in the 2010s than Texas, I mean, I'd have been roasted on Twitter, right? I mean, nobody would have believed me. I mean, I would have been hard for me to believe myself, but that was the reality, is that Texas struggled mightily on the field. But from a national brand standpoint and from a athletic department standpoint, they're still number one. It's still Texas, and the amount of money that comes in from Texas cannot be ignored. And Oklahoma, right now, I would say with Lincoln Riley, a young head coach. Yes, they've had struggles in the CFP, but they were cleaning house in the Big 12. Now, I expect stiffer competition in the SEC, but they're still, I'd say, a top 4 or 5 college football program right now. I mean, right now, it's really Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, kind of clustering there in the top 3. I think you could throw a Georgia, an Oklahoma in that discussion. Some people might say Florida, maybe a Notre Dame, but there's a gap between those top 3 schools and everybody else. But still, Oklahoma's there. They're there. They're playing in these games against those elite schools. They're just not competing in them. So, again, as far as this scheduling alliance with the ACC and the Big Ten and the Pac-12, it makes sense to me. It's something that I look at and go, well, it seems like the natural reaction from these 3 conferences, because we're watching the Big 12 scramble / disintegrate in front of our eyes here, and I think everybody wants a piece of the pie, and so in order to keep that seat at the table, these other 3 conferences need to get together and say, listen, this is in our best interest to stick together and try and make this work. I mean, again, because if you're the SEC, you've scarfed up now Texas, Oklahoma. That strengthens their position. It pretty much has doomed the Big 12 to second-tier status. But if the 3 conferences we've mentioned, right, ACC, Big 10, or Pac-12, if they stick together, it'll give them a lot of leverage at the college football playoff, discussion, the table there, where they're going to be jockeying for spots. Whatever playoff expansion looks like, it's going to, a larger field, if it's more than 4 teams, it's going to be worth more than what it is now. And right now it's worth $475 million annually. Now, whether the networks pay more for non-conference games, that's really it's to be determined. But I don't think that's the point, right? Like, we're not having these discussions and these moves aren't being made based on what the TV networks are going to pay. I mean, this is about Texas and Oklahoma, I think, realizing long-term success, long-term stability. It's the SEC. I mean, the Big 12, I think, had its moments. Again, I just mentioned, right? TCU had a better success, or had a better decade of success than Texas did, on the field in football. And Oklahoma has won the last handful of conference championships, and Baylor has had some good runs, and Kansas State has had some good runs. Even Iowa State with Matt Campbell, recently they've had some good runs, but it just hasn't. There's not been a national brand to emerge. There's not been a program that has stayed consistent at the top. And yes, there are a lot of people who ridicule Texas. But again, the important thing here is that you can't ignore the money that's coming in. You cannot ignore the money. One interesting little wrinkle that's worth mentioning in this discussion is basically, the scheduling alliance, while simple in theory, is more difficult and nuanced in actual practice, because there's non-conference contracts you have to kind of deal with. There's conference media rights, right? You've got, not only do you have conference media rights for each of these conferences, they all expire in different years, right? The Big 10, their conference media rights expire in 2023. The Pac-12s expire in 2024, and the ACCs, they don't expire until 2036. That's 15 years down the road. Now, can deals be worked out? Certainly. Will deals be worked out? Potentially. I think it's safe to say that those kinds of things can, be reconfigured. But, listen, I kind of said this earlier in the show, and I firmly believe it could be a thing. You could certainly see, I can envision a scenario where the ACC, the Big Ten, and the Pac-12 get together and say, okay, we are going to schedule non-conference opponents exclusively in this league we have created. And they'll shut out the SEC from playing them in non-conference. And if that happens, that is real leverage. That is real leverage because, yes, the SEC will be the deepest conference. Yes, the SEC will be the conference with the most market value and branding. But at the end of the day, non-conference opponents still matter. And if you can't play anyone in the three conferences I just named, who are you going to play? BYU? UConn? UMass? Army? I mean, who are your non-con? I mean, yeah, you'll pick up somebody from the American, right? Nick Saban, he's got McNeese State on speed dial, or who is it, Alabama A&M, or maybe he'll pick up the phone and call New Mexico State. But realistically, right, it's a big deal. It's a huge deal if those three conferences were able to, basically shut out the SEC from playing them in a non-conference setting. Like Florida State would not be a thing anymore. You'd be getting Ohio State and USC, right? I mean, again, college football is a regional sport. I think that's why that's why the fan base is so passionate and so fervent about their respective schools, is because it's a regional thing with regional ties. It's not a national corporate feeling sport. And that's what we're getting towards. We are slowly working our way towards that sort of nationalization of college football, which I don't think is, for the long term, a good thing. But that's, it's hard to stop the train once the wheels are rolling. But yeah, I mean, you could certainly see a scenario where Florida State are no longer able to play each other unless, and this is a whole nerdy, in the weeds kind of discussion, which has happened at a couple different state legislatures, where by law schools would have to play each other. So like Oklahoma's state legislature right now is discussing should Oklahoma have to continue to play Oklahoma State, because obviously with Oklahoma joining the Big 12, their schedule's going to completely change, and what used to be a conference game for them will certainly no longer be a conference game. It'll probably be a non-conference game if it's even scheduled at all. And there are certainly some good ACC-SEC rivalries that, while maybe not close in recent years, have huge historical significance. I mean, you look at the Palmetto State, you get Clemson, South Carolina. You look at clean old-fashioned hate with Georgia Tech. You look at Florida State and Florida. There's probably at least a few more that I'm... Louisville and Kentucky. The Wildcats taking on the Cardinals. I mean, there's and those are all in-state. That's 4 in-state rivalries where teams are on opposite sides. One's in the ACC, one's in the SEC, but it's still the biggest rivalry game in their respective state. Clemson, South Carolina, there's no other football programs in the state that come close to it in terms of size and importance. Same with Georgia and Georgia Tech. Florida's a little bit different. But Kentucky and Louisville, that's as big as it gets there. So there's some pretty big implications for this scheduling alliance and whether or not it actually pans out. But again, so far it's just been preliminary discussions. I'm really interested to see where it goes, because I think it is something that could potentially happen. And I think, because of the SEC's tendency to kind of puff their chest out and we're the best, and kind of say, no, we don't need to play y'all, it could come back to bite them, because all these other conferences with these other schools could get, well, fine, don't play us. Go play Akron, go play these group of 5 schools that aren't going to look good on your resume at all, and you're just going to have to go off of, your in-conference schedule, which certainly will land them playoff spots. That's not the question here. The question is, how will they be able to hold up in a college football playoff game against, a team from the Big Ten or the Pac-12 or the ACC? You know, what would that matchup look like for an SEC school that doesn't have any experience with those kinds of teams? So not sure. We'll have to see how this pans out. Interesting discussion though, and it's, I don't know. I saw it and I was like, wow, this is something I could see actually happening. So we'll take a break. We come back though. It's segment 2. We're going to be talking about the Big 12. Is it doomed to failure? The answer may surprise you. That's next. Welcome back to the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Again, I'm Jay Smith, and you are listening to After Further Review. Hey, listen, if you're listening to the show as a podcast, it doesn't matter where you're listening. It could be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and you're enjoying the content, be sure to drop a follow, maybe subscribe to the podcast so you get new episodes that'll pop up on your phone every time I post, or maybe even leave a nice little review if you enjoy the content. And if you're watching on Facebook, do appreciate it as always. You're welcome to drop a like, drop a comment. Any sort of feedback is always appreciated, and I do usually listen or read whatever is commented. So do appreciate it. But let's get back now to this discussion about the Big 12. You know, is it doomed, and where are the current Big 12 members most likely to end up? Okay, so let's start right off the bat. Do I think the Big 12 is doomed? Yes. I think it is doomed regardless of any further existence. It is doomed to a eternal second-tier status, meaning it may survive. It may continue to be a thing, till I'm gone, right? 80, 90 years down the road, could still be around. But it's never going to be what it was. It's never going to go back. It's just not going to go back. There's no scenario right now that I can imagine where the Big 12 goes back to the prominence, if you even want to call it that, that it had a month and a half ago. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, where are the remaining 8 schools going to end up? Well, let's go back and let's do a history lesson. So about 10 years ago, the last realignment phase of major college football programs, the conference lost Nebraska to the Big 10, Colorado to the Pac-12, and Mizzou and Texas A&M to the SEC. Now, it made up for those losses by adding TCU, again, a program that we touched on, had more success on the field in football in the 2010s than Texas, but I digress. They added TCU and West Virginia. And that sort of kept the ship afloat, right? That wasn't like, oh, wow, West Virginia. It was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. And West Virginia had a few great years. TCU had a few great years under Gary Patterson. The name of the coach at West Virginia, his name is escaping me, but I can picture him. He had like that, not the mullet, but his bald on top and it was flowing in the back. I don't know his name. I'm sure somebody listening remembers his name. But anyway, I think he's not there anymore. But either way, those programs had a little spurt of greatness, right? They had a few moments in the spotlight. But ultimately, I don't think they they certainly didn't replace Nebraska. Again, a team that has been pretty terrible the last decade and a half, but it's still Nebraska. There's still staying power, and there's still money involved when you're talking about the Cornhuskers. Again, the Big 12 they kind of plugged the hole in the ship, right? The ship is sinking. Let's kind of patch it, and it held over. Now, the 2 biggest buckets in your boat that you were using to bail yourself out with, they're gone. They jumped over into so you're left with almost nobody in terms of national brands. And where are these other schools going to go? It seems unlikely. Again, we're going a little bit into the weeds with this type of discussion, but it seems unlikely for any of these schools to just, like Texas Tech, they're not just going to wait around and go, well, maybe Oklahoma and Texas won't be able to get out of the Big 12 because of grant of rights, and maybe they can sue because the bylaws state that there's contract. That again, unlikely to happen. What's more likely to happen is these schools find new conferences. So with that, let's get into our little list. Let's start at the top. Let's start with Baylor. Now Baylor is, it's an interesting school, right? They kind of navigated through those sanctions that ended the Art Briles era. They went to a Sugar Bowl, and they proved they can be successful in this new era of college football. And look, they won a national championship in men's basketball this past year. I picked them. Second time I've ever picked the Natty champs correct. It was Duke in 2015 and now Baylor this year. So, I think Baylor kind of, because of some of their other issues, like across the entire athletic department, those of you who pay attention to college football probably know what I'm referring to. I don't see the ACC or the Big Ten jumping at Baylor. And I don't think the Pac-12 really, fits Baylor well. And actually there was an interesting article I read not too long ago that talked about how there was a time where Baylor had talked about joining the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 officials didn't like there was a culture clash with Baylor and the Pac-12 schools, which makes sense because you think about where the Pac-12 schools are, and you think about Baylor, and I think it's a Methodist university. So that probably wasn't going to jive. So the most likely landing spot for Baylor is the AAC. Now, before you start freaking out about Baylor dropping to a group of 5, let's go through this, okay? The Big 12 TV contract's not going to be worth nearly as much without Texas and Oklahoma. We've talked about that. There's going to be a clear path, though, for group of 5 teams to the CFP. So the AAC is a pretty attractive option for Baylor, because if they can come in, sort of rebuild the program a little bit, get back into a consistent 8, 9, 10 win kind of setting, they very well could be able to thrive in the American and work their way up. And who knows, if the American absorbs enough teams, they kind of take the place of the former Big 12. So we'll see, but that's my prediction for Baylor, is they'll end up in the American. All right, let's talk about Iowa State. Now, this is one of the more, I think this is an easy one for me. Iowa State joining the Big Ten makes a ton of sense, right? The Cyclones are already rivals with Iowa, the Hawkeyes, who are in the Big Ten. They are also, and this is important from an academic standpoint, Iowa State is a member of the Association of American Universities, AAU, and it's the most prestigious research universities in the country get this certification of being an AAU university. As we all know, the Big Ten likes to pride itself on being academically conscious, so that checks a box right there. And, Iowa State has a Midwest feel, just in the athletic programs, the campus, the student population. And Matt Campbell's a guy that was born in Ohio. He played at Mount Union, and he coached at Toledo. So, again, I think you could easily see Iowa State joining the Big Ten. I think it makes sense to me. Certainly there's other conferences they may consider joining, but I think that's not a too terribly controversial pick. Let's look at Kansas. Now, Kansas, as we've touched on with Baylor, right? They have a great basketball program, and they are also a member of the Association of American Universities. Again, football, they're not elite or competitive or relevant at all. Kansas football could cease to exist tomorrow and hardly anybody would care, but their basketball program is, as long as it stays out of trouble with the NCAA. So, again, with these conferences, the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12 essentially holding an auction and picking who they want, you may not be able to pick a football powerhouse every single round, right? You might have to go, well, it's a basketball school. It's Kansas. Maybe the Big Ten West would be a good spot for them. It could take a while for their football program to kind of get caught up to speed with the physicality of the Big Ten, but I could see Kansas becoming a respectable program in that conference. Kansas State, however, is in a load of trouble. They need to start picking up the phone and making some calls. They have not had a lot of success on the football field recently. I mean, we go back to the Colin Klein, Snyder era that ended. One time they were number one in the country. Feels like a decade and a half ago. They're not a national brand. They don't play in a big media market, and they're not a member of that AAU, research certification thing. So I see them going to the Mountain West. I think they'll slide into the Mountain West. They'll become a pretty good football program there. Maybe they can actually expand their recruiting footprint a little bit and sort of get out of that, market that they're in currently. And, they won't be fighting other Big 12 schools for recruits. So I don't know if it's necessarily a demotion, but, long-term health of this athletic program, Mountain West Conference makes sense, especially when you consider the new CFP format is going to have spots for Group of 5 teams. So if a Baylor or a Kansas State does well, they could possibly get themselves a seat at the table. And at the end of the day, a seat at the table is still a seat at the table. So, revenue jump maybe for them, possibly. We'll see. Let's talk Oklahoma State. Now, the Cowboys, I think, are one of the more desirable teams left in the Big 12 that doesn't have an obvious second home. Like Iowa State, if they're going to go anywhere, they're going to the Big 10. They're not going to go to the ACC, and they're certainly not going to go to the Pac-12. So Iowa State going to the Big 10, non-controversial. Oklahoma State, though, could they fit in the ACC? Could they fit into Big 10? What about the Pac-12? In fact, I think, with the addition of Oklahoma State to the Pac-12, because make no mistake about it, right? Prior to this announcement by Oklahoma and Texas moving to the SEC, raise your hand if you think Pac-12 was the worst Power 5 conference. Your hand should be in the air. Your hand should be in the air, okay? Because they were. The Pac-12 was the worst Power 5 conference, not just in their decision makings, but just from a whole, football standpoint. They were not competitive at all, and hardly anybody was paying attention to them. So an Oklahoma State, which is a program that, has shown that they can compete, fairly consistently. I wouldn't say that they're up there with the Oklahomas, but if you could get the Cowboys out west, that could go a long way to kind of changing the perception of the Pac-12. And listen, Oklahoma State, right? That's a great opportunity to expand your recruiting zone. There is one silver lining for a lot of these schools, like a Baylor or a Kansas State or whoever you are. It's that your recruiting footprint has a potential to be expanded quite a bit, because all of a sudden you're going to be playing schools in states that you probably never recruited from, ever. And who knows? You might land a 3 or a 4-star from there every once in a while. So, the Pac-12 for Oklahoma State makes sense. It would be a much easier path to the CFP because of how weak the Pac-12 is currently. And it'd be out of Oklahoma's shadow in the SEC. So, I don't know. That's what I think about the Cowboys. All right, TCU. Now, this is a school that I think, again, the American might try to go after. Again, the Horned Frogs joined the Big Ten about 10 years ago. But I think TCU, I think they're a big enough brand to attract the Pac-12. I do. I think they've had enough success in football in the last few years. They're a legitimate threat, possibly, to win a division or maybe even the conference on a year-in, year-out basis. And listen, the Pac-10, a lot of people remember this, but the Pac-10 almost became the Pac-16. The last time we did this whole realignment thing, the Pac-10, which was originally the Pac-8, we're going way back here, okay, they were looking to add a lot of schools. It didn't end up happening. They ended up sticking with the Pac-12. But if it poaches 3 to 4 teams from the, let's be honest, the soon-to-be defunct Big 12, TCU could absolutely be one of them. I could see the Horned Frogs in the Pac-12. I can see them doing well and competing for conference championships. All right, Texas Tech is next up here. So the Red Raiders might be on the radar of the Pac-12, but There's other schools we've already touched on that I think are more attractive to the Pac-12. So Texas Tech is probably going to end up looking at the American Conference. Again, this is an opportunity for Texas Tech to sort of raise its profile in a pretty big way. It would be a good landing spot for them. And if, Texas Tech and Baylor join the American, you've already got programs like Houston and SMU in the American. So you got 4 Texas schools in the American. That would be a big deal, okay? I know they're not Texas, but they're still 4 Texas schools, right? Texas Tech, Baylor, Houston, SMU. And then obviously you have traditional powers in UCF and Memphis. That's a pretty strong group of 5 conference. That's a pretty damn strong group of 5 conference. UCF, Memphis, Houston, SMU, Texas Tech, Baylor. I would watch the American. I mean, I already do, but that would be like, yeah, heck yeah, I'm watching the American Conference. So I could see the Red Raiders ending up in the American. All right, let's talk West Virginia. This is the last school left on the list. Where will the Mountaineers end up? Not too much of a surprise here, but it's going to probably be the ACC. They're not really going to be attractive to the Big Ten. I don't see the Big Ten looking at West Virginia and being like, oh yeah, y'all embody everything we want in institutions. Let's pick you. No, the SEC is not gonna look at West Virginia, and the Pac-12 is not even an option. So it's really going to be, I think, the ACC. The reason for that is because the Big Ten and the ACC really, they only need a couple more teams, 1 or 2 more teams to get to this 16-team super conference status. And listen, the ACC is reserving a spot for Notre Dame, right? Notre Dame is essentially the 15th member of the ACC. There will come a point when Notre Dame joins the ACC in football. It will happen. It is inevitable. And West Virginia could be that 16th slot. Now, I know Notre Dame right now is happy with their independence. They're going to hold out for another television deal in football. But I still think the ACC is eyeballing Notre Dame and West Virginia to kind of cap off its 16-team super conference, if you will. And that keeps the Mountaineers in major college football, but it also kind of allows them to, pick up some rivalry games that they had to put on the back burner, like the Pitt rivalry, right? West Virginia Pitt's a pretty big rivalry. It's the what's it called? The backyard brawl, and it would I think benefit both the ACC and West Virginia. Again, from a cultural standpoint, West Virginia may not embody everything the ACC does, but you're always going to kind of have that black sheep, and West Virginia, they're a black sheep, to be sure. So those are my predictions on where I think the remaining Big 12 schools will end up. I'd love to hear what you have to say, though. If you've got a conference that you think, or a school that you think is going to end up in a different conference, let me know. You can tweet at the show at After Further Review. You can leave a comment on the Facebook video, or you can leave it in your review of the podcast. However you want to get your point across. And I'm sure I'll post some show clips to Instagram soon, so you can always get a comment in there. But it's interesting discussion. And again, I might be wrong on all of these, but that's just kind of where my gut's telling me that these schools are going to end up. All right, last break of the show. We're going to come back and wrap it up, and let's talk a little bit about what the CFP format will look like after this fall. That's next. You won't want to miss it. Welcome back to the show. Last segment of this episode of After Further Review. Do appreciate you tuning in. And I'm Jay Smith, as always, bringing you another episode of your favorite college football podcast. Let's talk some CFP news. Listen, I promise that the next episode we will actually preview this coming season. It's only a few weeks away. I'm excited for the Clemson-Georgia game kicking off September 4th. Looking forward to that. But let's talk about this CFP proposal and what it looks like now and how it'll possibly change. It will change. But of course, as I'm sure many people know, the management committee for the college football playoff is considering an expansion from the current 4-team field to a 12-team format. Now, this would be, a pretty big change, right? We're not going 4-6, we're not going 4-8, we're going 4-12. And this is where things kind of get interesting, because this proposal does not include guarantees for conference champions. There's been a lot of ire in the last few years with schools winning their conference championship and people saying, well, they're undeserving, but they're going to get in anyway because they're a conference champion. Oklahoma. But either way, right? It still is an interesting development, because up till now, conference championships have always meant something, right? If you win your conference, that means something. Well, that kind of goes out the window now, right? There's no guarantee for conference champions, and it's a bracket that'll include the six highest ranked conference champions. Oh wait, so conference champions. You see how this it just irritates me, right? Like don't say conference championships don't matter and then reserve spots for conference champions. Like, I just don't understand the need to flip-flop there. They either matter or they don't. So in this scenario, like, if you don't have guarantees, fine, but then you're going to reserve the 6 highest ranked conference champions? Like, what? Anyway, so it's those 6 teams plus the 6 highest ranked other teams as determined by the CFP's selection committee. And there would be no limit on the number of participants from a conference. The SEC, they're just grinning and rubbing their hands together. They love to hear that. There's no limit. So we could see an all SEC, half a bracket. And also, one last note, no league would automatically qualify. Now, this proposal was written by a subcommittee comprised of the Big 12 commissioner, Bob Bowlesley, the SEC commissioner, Greg Sankey, Notre Dame athletic director, Jack Swarbrick, and Mountain West commissioner, Greg Thompson. And it was presented to the entire group of FBS commissioners last month. And, it's received, I think, pretty positive feedback. There's certainly been some negative responses, but overall, people are willing to give this a shot. I think there's almost uniform consensus that this 4-team style, especially now that the Big 12 is basically not going to exist anymore, there's going to have to be some sort of change to the system and the structure of this playoff. But it's really going to be interesting to see how the news of the conference realignment will affect the discussions pertaining to the college football playoff format, because all this news that we're discussing here, right? This was a proposal that came out early June, and obviously a few weeks later, Oklahoma and Texas said, "Hey, peace out, Big 12. We're going to the SEC." So all of that is probably going to, be up for debate. I think ultimately, it's going to be, I think, an open discussion as far as what this playoff, looks like, and how, schools get buy-ins and seeding and how that sort of works. I think, it's a well thought out plan, honestly. I think it's a little more fair. It gives, again, as we've touched on, it gives those group of 5 schools a shot, gives them a chance to maybe get a berth. And, there's no part of this that stands out to me as like an inherent weakness or a flaw that makes me go, well, that's dumb. The only thing is the conference, I'm a little iffy on. You're not going to guarantee spots for conference champions, but you're going to save 6 spots for the top-ranked conference champions. Am I the only one that's a little bit confused by that? But either way, other than that, I think it's a pretty fair shake at the whole thing. So, like in this scenario, right? Like if you're Notre Dame and you're the number 1 team in the country, you can't get a bye, or you can't be seeded higher than number 5. Because you're not, you're not in a conference technically, and you're not going to be playing for a conference championship. So, the selection committee's top 25 is different from the seeding because the top 4 seeds go to the highest ranked conference champions. So it really, I think, motivates Notre Dame to consider joining the ACC, which, as I've touched on in the previous segment, is something I believe ultimately it will happen. I believe Notre Dame will join the ACC, and it could be a move like this, but with the college football playoff proposal, where if Notre Dame doesn't and they stay independent, they're so severely handicapped that they don't care about a potential exclusive TV rights deal with NBC. They want to be in better position for the playoff, and this is the kind of rule I think that could force that hand. So, the other thing that a lot of people are talking about is, well, how would the scheduling work? What bowl games would be included, and how does that tie in? So, according to this proposal, the first round games would take place on campus sometime during the 2-week period following conference championship games. The quarterfinals would be played on New Year's Day or the day after, and this would allow for the possibility, there is a possibility here, if you do the math, of teams competing in 17 games. But that's a pretty unlikely scenario. In order for that to happen, a team seeded 5 through 12 would have to play in a conference championship game, qualify for a first round game, and then run the table to win a national championship. So it could be done. It won't be done because it's just not realistic. It's not going to happen. It's not impossible. It's certainly not impossible, but there's a lot of checks and balances that have been built into this that make that very unlikely. So, I think, again, from the outside looking in, it seems to be pretty solid. I like the proposal, and I like how the system works, and it doesn't exclude group of 5 teams, because I think you should include those conferences in any sort of national playoff. I don't like to see conferences excluded just because they're not in the Power 5. It's a group of 5 teams, so they have no shot, right? That's what we've been saying for the last however long we've been doing this playoff now, 4, 5, 6 years, and it's like, well, if you're a group of 5 school, good luck. You might get a New Year's 6 bid. That's it. And yeah, some schools have gotten shots, right? You had Cincinnati taking on Georgia, and hey, Cincinnati's got to win that game, right? Super close. Cincinnati could have pulled that one out. They didn't. So until those group of 5 schools start playing and beating the Power 5 schools, it's going to be a hard case to make. But still, I like to see those conferences and schools included. One thing, though, that's a little bit of a bummer is that home field advantage would that wouldn't be a thing after the opening round, which is when those top 4 conference champions would receive byes. So if the playoff kind of operates under this contract that's proposed with the bowl games, it would have to honor its agreements, right, with those New Year's 6 bowls, unless everybody said, nah, we can change them, and so again, that's a little bit more technical. That's a little bit more in the weeds, and I think a lot of this stuff has to get passed and approved before we have a discussion of, oh, well, is the quarterfinal going to be the Chick-fil-A Bowl, or is it just going to be the quarterfinal game? Like, we're not there yet. But I think it would still give the bowls significance. It would still give them meaning, and it would still give them a spot in the lore and the tradition and the pageantry of the postseason of college football. And New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, those are college football days, man. That's when you have the Rose Bowl, and it's a huge tradition in college football. So I want to see that come back. I want to see New Year's Eve, New Year's Day football games being a big deal in the landscape of college football. This might push back the dates of the semifinals and the college football national championship, obviously, just because you're playing more games. But again, the scheduling semantics of all this are yet to be determined. So a lot of this stuff is TBD, and it's still sort of all up in the air. And again, all of this is subject to change now that The Big 12 has lost Oklahoma and Texas that are now in the SEC. So I really don't think we're going to see a larger college football playoff bracket, more than 12. That just seems, God, that seems like way too much of, it's too much too soon. I think the expansion to 12 could work. It's going to need some tweaking possibly, but you need to figure out if the 12 thing works before you just leap and make it, because they're never going to make it smaller. They're never going to make it smaller. They're just going to make it bigger. So if you go from 4 to 12, what's your next option? You're going to go 16? You're going to go 20? I mean, at that point, you're like, you got to cut down on the number of conference games. You have to. I mean, there's just no way that you can expect these college kids to play 18 to 20 games. That's an NFL season. I mean, already 17 games. That's more than the NFL plays in their regular season, right? They play 16 games, and they've got, or did they add another regular season? I don't pay attention to the NFL anymore, but I feel like they added a regular season game and made 7. I know they've got more teams in the playoff now. There's 14 playoff teams in the NFL, but either way, right? That's professional football, and this is college football. So trying to keep some small line between the two now that the name, image, likeness stuff in college athletics has been pushed through, that kind of, all the amateurism just went out the window. But that's a topic for another day, and we are out of time on this edition of After Further Review. Really appreciated you listening and tuning in. I enjoyed bringing it to you. Look out for more episodes soon. Going to try and keep these pretty consistent throughout the fall, do as many as I can. But yeah, like I said, it's just crazy, man. There's so much to talk about, so much news that comes out every day, college football related, and we will be breaking down some of the big games from the opening weeks of college football coming up on the next few episodes. Promise I will get to them. I want to talk about them. They're exciting matchups. There's so much else to talk about. There's so much else going on. So we'll get to it here pretty soon. Thanks so much for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your day. I'm Jay Smith, and this has been After Further Review.